John here for MTG Nexus Red, coming at you with a little bit of a different video. This time kind of explaining what Modern Burn is, why people play it, why it's had such a lasting impact on the Modern format. Even more times it's been a tier 1 deck, other times it's where it currently is, it's kind of a fringe deck that sees a little bit of play when someone's getting into the format, maybe doesn't have a ton of time to study the format, and it's just kind of a deck people hold on to play at their LGS or lower level events like leagues and such. So, at its core, Mono Red Burn, or Red Burn, is a red-based aggro deck that is notable not only for its creatures but also for its direct damage spells. Cards that can deal damage directly to your opponent rather than relying on creatures or other effects to deal the damage, mostly in the form of lightning bolt-esque effects which deal chunks of 3 damage to your opponent's face to another target. This has been kind of an iconic part of Burn since the days of Mono Red Sly. Basically, you get down cheap red creatures, you get in some early damage, and then you try to finish your opponent off with direct damage spells. Prowess, in some regards, is similar, although Prowess is much more reliant on its creatures. So that's where the two decks kind of differentiate, is whether the deck is more reliant on creatures or more reliant on spells, really, to finish the game. Burn has kind of always been an iconic deck. Number one, it's usually pretty cheap. Number two, it's a fairly simple deck to pick up on in terms of the first 80 or 90% of learning to play the deck. And number three, usually when red is good, red aggro is good, the format is usually pretty healthy because number one, red aggro decks are usually not that hard to hate out. I mean, big green creatures can usually do it. Life gain, kind of mid-range control can kind of do it. And then fast combo can, just outspeed the deck overall. So there's usually not a number of ways to counter this deck. But whenever it's a good centerpiece of the format, it's usually a pretty good indication that you have a healthy, rather diverse format. On the other side, when Burn is pretty fringe, usually one of two things are going on. Either the format is extremely mid-rangey with a lot of arbitrary life gain, think Omnath metas, or metas kind of like we're in now with Boros mid-range, or the deck is format is very combo-oriented, and Burn just can't compete with the speed, and its hate tools just simply aren't strong enough for the deck to be relevant in the format. So I've played Modern Burn for probably going on 7-8 years now, possibly even longer, and I've seen Burn at its worst, Burn at its best, whether it was Eldrazi Winter, whether it was pre-MH1, post-MH1, post-MH2, now post-MH3. This is a deck that's mostly stood the test of time, but unfortunately has kind of aged out of the format a little bit in terms of if you want to compete usually at the highest levels. But getting down to what the deck does. You pair early haste creatures like Monastery, Swiftspear, and Goblin Guide. Then you start using cards like Eidolon and the Great Revel to kind of bridge into the mid-game, or into the early second and third turns of the game. Then you start trying to use direct damage spells like Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt to start getting your opponent down. Then you hope to top deck and finish them off. Things like Boros Charm, Rift Bolt, etc. The thing with Burn number one is Burn is a critical mass deck. Yes, you have the creatures which can do a fairly good amount of damage, but the rest of the deck is largely the same thing. Lightning Bolt and Lava Spike both do the same amount of damage to your opponent's face. Skullcrack costs 1 more mana, but does prevent life gain. Searing Blaze is a special card that can targets both a creature and an opponent or a planeswalker they control. And then if you have Landfall, does 3. So a lot of these cards do a lot of the same thing. Rift Bolt, Skewer the Critics, almost the same as Lightning Bolt, just a little bit more conditional in what they do and their timing. And they can potentially cost a little bit more, either 3 mana, or 1 mana in a turn, or 1 mana sorcery speed after you've already dealt damage to an opponent that turn. And finally, Boros Charm is kind of the main reason people play white in today's modern Burn decks. There are other cards you can play like Lightning Helix and such, but we probably won't be covering that in the scope of this particular video. That said, like I said, Burn is a aggressive deck. It usually tops out around turn 4, can kill on its really, really good draws turn 3. That's usually the benchmark of where Burn is good versus where Burn is bad. If the format is faster than turn 4, unless Eidolon of the Great Revel or one of its narrow sideboard cards is really good, think something like Sanctifier and Vec, Burn can be pretty poor in a format where decks like Amulet Titan, Living End, Team of Rhinos are the norm, or it can be really poor in a format where decks like Omnath Midrange and for now Boros Energy are the norm, where you have decks with early interaction, bunch of arbitrary life gain, and then this over-the-top game that just beats what Burn does. So it's kind of where the deck is, kind of where the deck is good. Why do people play the deck? I've already kind of covered number one. It's usually one of the cheaper decks to bridge into a format like Modern from, say, Pioneer or Standard. Number two, fairly simple deck to pick up. The first 80 or 90% of the deck is usually pretty easy to learn. The key things coming down is how to mulligan, sequencing, learning about mana efficiency. Basically, you always want to play your most mana efficient turn if possible most of the time. There are some situations, like when you're playing around counter spells and some other things, you don't necessarily do that, or you need to kill on a particular creature of your opponent's. Sometimes you have to cast a Lightning Bolt when you'd rather cast, say, an Eidolon. But, like I said, the first 80-90% of the deck, pretty easy to pick up. Last 10 to 20% can be a challenge. There are people that have mastered or come close to mastering that 10 to 20%. Sometimes feel I'm there, sometimes I feel I'm pretty boneheaded with some decisions. So I can't even say I'm a Burn master, but I have been playing it for, quite some time. And then, like I said, it's fairly easy to get into the format. It's a deck that usually doesn't require a ton of updating. So, if you bought Burn back in 2015, maybe you're 10 to 20 cards off of that if you decide to pick it back up 9 years later here in 2024. Which is both good and bad in terms of it's good that you don't have to pick up a ton of new cards for the deck to be good. It's bad in terms of, power creep in a format where they're pumping things in with, the universes beyond, like Lord of the Rings sets, Modern Horizons 1, 2, and 3. And Burn hasn't really gotten a lot of tools lately, which we'll talk about when we kind of talk about why the deck maybe isn't the best deck to pick up if you want to be a tier Modern player at all times. Another good thing, Burn, generally speaking, will not suffer any bans because none of its cards are that powerful, individually at least. Although there was one notable exception in aggro deck / Burn history, that being Wild Nacatl. But generally speaking, with Burn, you're fairly safe from bans. It's a fairly easy deck to learn. It can be quite competitive, especially at the lower levels like F&M, your local RCQs, leagues in MTGO sometimes, depending on how meta everyone's being. It's a deck that if you win a lot of die rolls and play tight, you can tend to do pretty well with, but it is a deck that does not beat everything in the format. Downside of Burn, as we've already kind of alluded to, number one, it really hasn't gotten too many new tools lately. Sure, it kind of got Flage out of MH3, although it's proven to not be the best card in the deck overall. It has picked up some sideboard options, but in terms of the core of the main deck, I think Roiling Vortex might be, either Roiling Vortex or Skewer the Critics might be the newest addition to the main deck. Some Canyon came out in MH1. The rest of the stuff honestly has been around for quite a while, and they haven't printed any of the legacy stuff like Fire Blast or Price of Progress or even Chain Lightning into the format. So Burn could really use a power boost. The format currently, as we're getting here toward the end of 2024 when I'm making this video, is a very fast combo, a lot of fast combo, and Boros midrange, Mardu Energy midrange, and Dimir Frog midrange, or Dimir Frog kind of the spiritual successor to Izzet Murktide. Not the healthiest format for burn. As I kind of alluded to, when the combo decks are faster than turn 4, and Eidolon doesn't really do a whole lot other than against specifically Storm, and then the mid-range decks have efficient removal, efficient creatures, quick board presence, lots of arbitrary life gain with things like Guide of Souls, Ocelot Pride, Flage. Burn tends to be better when the decks are like Jund. Take a lot of damage from their mana base, play things like Thoughtseize. Yes, they have things like Tarmogoyf, but they also play things like Dark Confidant. Things that are using their life total as a resource. Burn is very good in those metas. Burn is very bad when things like Omnath and Solitude are paired with, Counterspell and Fury to buy them time, into Omnath plus land, into the One Ring. So basically Burn's in a spot where when the mid-range decks don't have a ton of arbitrary life gain, and they're not a turn 4 deck themselves, or the combo decks are like turn 3, turn 4, and can be disrupted by, Eidolon or Sanctifier and back, or Rest in Peace, or, cards that are commonly played in Burn, Burn can be in a pretty decent spot. Right now is not one of those times, but still it's a good bridge into the format, and one of the best decks in the format is currently a Boros deck, albeit in a completely different form. As far as the sideboard, one of the reasons why Boros has become the main version of Burn rather than Rakdos or Gruul or Izzet or Mono Red, or what was the other combination? Is basically White has the best sideboard cards in Modern historically, whether in days gone by it was things like Stony Silence and Rest in Peace. Now cards, everything from Orim's Chant, Path to Exile, Deflecting Palm, Sanctifier and back, Rest in Peace. There's been a lot of things that White has offered to Burn over the years that have been like lockdown pieces, like Stony Silence against Lantern, Prison, and Affinity decks, or Rest in Peace against Living End and Dredge, or Sanctifier and back against Rakdos Scam when that was a deck. Burn has benefited tremendously from White being one of the best sideboard option colors in Modern. Now that's a little bit less so these days, but it still does have a lot of efficient things, like Path to Exile, which answers every creature. And then you have your Shatter effects, which also tend to deal your opponent damage, so they tend to be on point. Searing Blood doubles nicely with Searing Blaze against small creature decks. Roiling Vortex helps prevent life gain along with your Skull Cracks. There's a lot of damage plus effects that have worked really well with Burn over the years, and has been one of the main reasons why Boros has ended up becoming the key thing. Now, what would you gain from blue? A little bit like counterspells. There are some prowess creatures that were fine over the years, and some cantrips, but that's more of a prowess thing now. Gruul has a Tarkus command, which is really the biggest draw to that, but green doesn't tend to have quite as good sideboard cards as white. Rakdos, you would have Hand Disruption, and there are a few unique options, such as the life gain card I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's black, red, and Reign of Gore. Players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented, and then things like Bowmasters and Bump in the Night. As far as blue, green, black, white, so of those options, typically Boros has been the best. A little bit cleaner mana base if you're not playing the 3 colors. Now that said, Burn at one point was a 3-color deck. It was Naya. It was Naya Burn, Naya Zoo were very similar. You would play Wild Nacatl, Goblin Guide, and Eidolon. This was before Swiftspear was printed. And then you played both a Tarkus Command and Boros Charm in your deck. You had less reason to play 2-color mana bases. You didn't have the Canopy lands. And Nacatl got burned, so that kind of put Burn a little bit to the side until Swiftspear got printed. Then they unbanned Nacatl, realizing in the Modern format that a card that just arbitrarily dies to Bolt, Fatal Push, now Bolt, Fatal Push, Path to Exile, every 2-mana removal spell in the format, etc. Just wasn't really that powerful when you're playing things like Ragavan and Ocelot Pride and God of Souls and Tarmogoyfs and Nethergoyfs and Death Shadows and Born Oculuses and Murktide Regents. 1-mana 3/3 versus a 2-mana 8/8. 2-mana 8/8 flyer, no less. Yeah, Burn has not aged gracefully in terms of its card power. It's more of a coherent strategy that tries to get the game over on turn 4. But as far as that, still a good bridge in the format. Boros is still typically the best you can. There are mono red versions of it out there. You lose some sideboard utility, but you get a much cleaner mana base, much cheaper mana base. So if you want to go even more budget to get in the modern format, mono red burn is also something you can look into. And there are a lot of other options and stuff that Burn has played over the years, and I might try to cover that in some of the other videos, like a listing of creatures Burn has done, listing of other spells that Burn has played over the years. But this was meant to be mainly an intro to the format, or an intro to the deck, to the format, why you would play the deck, why you wouldn't play the deck. The next video in this series, we're going to be going over a couple of games, seeing how the deck plays out, kind of like learning how to evaluate an opening hand, learning how to evaluate your sequencing of your plays. There's a lot of different simple but yet important foundations to understand about Modern Burn. And it's been a while since I've covered it, and I don't believe I've covered it on this channel. I covered it over on the main MTG Nexus channel, and it's definitely lost in a pile of other videos that I made over on that channel. So I figured I'd get back to the basics of Modern Burn and kind of show you guys how the deck does when it's doing what it's supposed to do, which is an intro to the format, and a sign that the format is healthy, and hope to get a love and appreciation back for Modern Burn. As always, if you like Modern Burn content, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you for our next video.